Good day, Ms. Sue. My name is Nick Marisa binti Nick Malahanif, and my student ID is 0340272, and I am the leader of my group. And today we will be discussing our research topic, which is human trafficking. Now, what exactly is human trafficking? It's one of the happenings in the world that is one of the major issues that takes away the victim's human rights. Thus, which is why we chose this topic to talk about, because it correlates to the victims having their human rights taken away from them. So human trafficking is basically forced labor, work being forced onto the victim against their will. So they would do stuff that they would not agree upon in the first place, such as sex exploitation, organs. They would have no consent towards it at all. So their abusers, which is people contributing to this human trafficking, they would typically use force, as in physical. They would physically threaten the victim by abuse with threats, so that the victim would the victim is forced to comply to whatever the abuser wants them to do in the forced labor they are required to do. So in this presentation, we will be talking a lot about the sex exploitation in human trafficking, along with organ harvesting, signs of sexual exploitation, along with the psychological effects.
Very good morning to Miss Sue. My name is Kavisha Anak Perempuan Kanaga Sundaram and my student ID is 03400085. For my topic, I will be talking about sex exploitation among adults and children. So, just to give a brief explanation about sex exploitation is a social crisis of significant magnitude as it can forcibly happen to anyone ranging from adults to children or even ranging from females to males. So my points for sex exploitation on human trafficking victims. My first point being young girls and women are mainly targeted as victims, as well as male victims are often neglected, as well as boundaries between sex workers and sex traffickers are often blurred. For my first point, which is females as human trafficking victims, sexual exploitation takes widely in the sex industry and is mainly targeted to young girls and women. So, based on this image, which was taken from a United Nations report, 51% of trafficking victims are women and 20% of human trafficking victims are girls. In accordance to that, according to a United Nations report, nearly three-quarters of detected victims of trafficking for sexual exploitations are females. So it's widely known that the majority of human trafficking victims as well as majority of sexually exploited victims are females. These are due to a number of reasons, one being that human traffickers see women as a weaker being as they are easily to be manipulated and are easily coerced into uh, getting into that kind of industry. And another reason being that females are defenseless to human traffickers. Um, if they were to be taken by force, then females are often weak in that sense, since human traffickers scout targets weak women and young girls as well. Focusing on this context as well, that the sex trafficking victims are being violated of their rights to freedom of slavery and forced labor, since since they may be taken as sex slaves to into prostitution in the sex industry. As for my second point, which is boys and men can be sexually exploited too, based on the previous slides, the majority of human trafficking victims as well as sexually exploited victims are females. So the male victims are significantly lesser than female victims. However, they can still be sexually exploited and they shouldn't be neglected by the public and government. Due to a few reasons, one being culture and gendered stereotypes, many do not consider males as victims because they are often seen as superior than the other genders. Um, Due, due to these reasons, male victims are often discriminated among female victims as they are not taken care of properly than female victims, since they are supposed to be strong and superior, so they shouldn't be victims that are sexually exploited. As for the second reason, um, Male victims, male can be victims through abuse of trust from perpetrators. So perpetrators could be anyone who has gotten close to the victims. For example, family members, relatives, friends, someone you just met who've gained your trust, and they can easily break that trust since um, boys and men are sorry boys and men, especially boys, can be um, manipulated since young to be sexually exploited, and they don't even know that it's not supposed to be like that. As for my last and final point, which is sex workers versus sex traffickers, the lines between sex workers and sex traffickers are often blurred. This is due to the fact where people may have chosen to work in the sex industry, who are sex workers, but are often manipulated or coerced by perpetrators, which are sex traffickers, to end up in an exploitative situation that they did not foresee. For example, based on a case study done, a girl named Denise, who was 13 years old, was pursued by her older boyfriend to get into prostitution to earn more money. And so she was later arrested and served in jail in like in multiple occasions due to her involvement. However, she was not identified as a human trafficking victim. From this example, you can see that people who work in the sex industry or people who just started working in the industry can be easily manipulated and can end up in an exploitative situation, just like Denise. So, in regards to that, uh, sex exploitation in To conclude, sex exploitation is an act where anyone, regardless of gender and age, can possibly be a victim, as it is a violation of rights to freedom from torture and degrading treatment. Thank you.
Good morning, Miss Sue. My name is Ashita Prabhadaran and my student ID is 0340991. The topic I'm going to talk about is signs of sexual exploitation. Why we need to know the signs of sexual exploitation? Well, this is because victims they are usually afraid to speak out or reach for help. They are afraid that people might look down on them, or maybe that their traffickers might hurt them if they find out. Being a victim of sexual exploitation is a very traumatic incident for the victims. So this is why that they won't be able to share their condition with other people. Therefore, it is very important for us to know how to recognize these signs so that we can identify the victims. What are the signs that we can notice on victims? So, one of the signs is physical abuse on victims' body. This is because usually victims they are tortured or beaten by the traffickers if they disobey them. So, physical abuse is a sign that can be seen very clearly on victims' body. They are usually in forms of bruises, scars, and burn marks. There are different types of burn marks in which I'll explain in the next slide. Okay. And health providers, they play a very important role because when a patient visits hospitals for treatment, the health providers that suspect that the patient might be one of the victims should do proper treatment like screening for the patients. Screening is when they screen the patient's whole body to detect if there are any bruises, scars, or burn marks. So moving on with our next slide. So these are the different types of burn marks like hot plate, knife, blade, cigarette, spark, curling iron, and so on. And cigarette is the most common type of burn marks can be seen on victims' body. Even in my research, I found that most of the victims experience burn marks in form of cigarettes. And fox is like if we see the burn marks in type in shape of fox. So moving on with our next slide. Okay, the next sign is when we see that a child or teenagers they are appearing with controlling adults. Usually these victims they are accompanied with one of the adults. Their traffickers usually accompany them with wherever they go because the traffickers are afraid that the victims might run away or approach for help. Okay. And where victims they frequently brought for medical treatment. So from these health workers, they should question their patients if they see that there are adults controlling the patient a lot. So by this, the patient will answer to them, and they also can identify if the patient is one of the victims. Okay, I've talked about the two important signs, which are physical abuse on body and child or teenagers appearing with controlling adults. People should know how to recognize these signs because victims they will not be able to approach people for help. We the one who needs to know how to recognize these signs so that we can identify if the person is a victim or not. So that's all from my part. I'll pass it to our next presenter, Ayla.
Good morning, Miss Su. My name is Ayla binti Muhammad Husaini and my student ID is 03402663. I would like to talk about the topic organ trafficking. Organ trafficking is a very big issue which the world is currently facing as of now. It robs people of their healthy lifestyle, and the organs include liver, heart, lungs, and kidneys. The most prominent organs are which is being traded illicitly are the kidneys. And according to the World Health Organization, WHO, it can be estimated that to between 5 to 10% organ transplants that occur yearly in the year of 2007. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of organ trafficking that includes the health risk, poverty, and also trauma. This is a picture of our human organs. This is the heart, the left lung, the right lung, liver, and they are all the important organs that include in organ trafficking scheme. Firstly, I would like to talk about a health risk a victim has to suffer due to organ trafficking. Majority of the victims have been kidnapped by the traffickers so that they because the traffickers want them to give their organs unwillingly. The victims have to go through a medical procedure, and they usually die from that medical procedure because of the wounds that has been inflicted upon them. So it hurts when they have to go through all that, and they are forced to do it. And when they do that, the traffickers will show no mercy upon them because traffickers are known to be very scary and they will never show mercy. So your wounds will be left untreated, and the victims will eventually die because of blood loss, infection, blood clots, and such. This is very depressing to victims because they didn't choose to live this life, and it is very sad that it occurred to them. Therefore, victims has to go through all of the obstacles due to organ trafficking. Next, moreover, poverty becomes a huge issue in organ trafficking. Well, traffickers love to manipulate their victims, especially the vulnerable ones. Traffickers love to trick their victims by giving them a large sum of money in order for the victims to trust them. But there are some cases where the victims will be made as a slave, and in order for the slaves to be set free, the traffickers will force them to give their organs. But this is a deadly situation, and everyone wants to escape, including the victims. So the victims have no choice but to give into their traffickers' wishes. I would like to go to point 3. Moreover, there's an emotional trauma due to organ trafficking. So victims will develop post-traumatic stress disorder, which is also known as PTSD. PTSD is a mental illness where you have to seek a professional help, a counseling to guide you to the right path. When you develop post-traumatic stress disorder, you will have these memories that keep on rushing back to you again in the current situation, where you will be afraid of what the future will hold for you. And you'll be afraid to embrace it, because when you are a victim of organ trafficking, everything is traumatic, and you have to go through the past again and again, and it keeps on replaying in your head. So you need a professional help, a professional person who is really good in guiding you to the right path again. Lastly, organ trafficking has to be stopped, and everyone needs to check their privileges because they have the awareness, and they can stop this by making a campaign so that people are more educated on organ trafficking. Organ trafficking can happen to anyone, your loved ones, anyone around you, your friends, because traffickers choose vulnerable people, and many people display their vulnerability. So in order to stop this, the government needs to implement laws so that this heinous crime can be stopped. Thank you for listening to my presentation on organ trafficking.
So just as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, my name is Nick Marisa binti Nick Mamahanif, and again, my student ID is 0340272. Well then, I will be discussing matters regarding psychological effects, and these are related to psychological effects of the victim. So my first point that I would like to talk about regarding the psychological effects on victims in human trafficking is that they tend to experience Stockholm Syndrome. Now, you must be wondering, what is Stockholm Syndrome? Stockholm Syndrome is a mental disorder that are commonly experienced by victims who face abuse. They start to feel the need to comply or to be obedient to their abuser, to their demands or whatsoever. And through this, they will form some sort of twisted, warped view towards their abuser, seeing them trying to convince themselves that their abuser is not that bad of a person. And this happens as a form of defense mechanism for the victims, because they do not want their abuser to harm them or kill them. So that's why they tend to become more compliant, and they develop this mental disorder called Stockholm Syndrome. And this happens because of a large amount of not only physical abuse, but mental abuse from any sorts of forms of threat, violence that they experience from their abusers, for their abusers to get them to obey their every word. So the frequent symptoms you see in someone who experiences Stockholm syndrome is that, like I mentioned just now, they develop these positive, maybe not real, but positive feelings towards their abuser to convince themselves this fabricated personality that their abuser has. And they tend to harbor negative feelings towards police and authority. And you're probably wondering why they would form these kind of feelings when police and authority would come in and rescue them anyway, because they would feel scared that if authority steps in between them and the abuser would think that they, in a way, the victim betrayed the abuser, and if the authorities were to not keep the victim safe, they would fear, what's the word? The consequences for supposedly betraying the abuser. So that's why they would harbor any negative feelings towards the abuser, the police. I'm so sorry. And my last point is, this is also another point I already mentioned just now, which is they become delusional regarding the abuser's humanity. As in, they are like, in a way, the victim lies to themselves regarding the reality of the abuser's humanity, trying to convince themselves that maybe the abuser isn't really that bad of a person. Yeah. Stop. The point I would like to touch on is that human trafficking victims deal with a great deal of depression. So depression is not like your typical feeling of sadness. Depression is when a person undergoes this extreme feeling of sadness, very deep sadness, and it is so great that it makes the victim lose any interest of doing any sort of normal daily activities, be it a hobby they used to enjoy, connecting with family members or friends, or social connections in general, excuse me, and having a normal routine. Their depression would cause them to be so demotivated to do anything, and they would just feel, well, sad. And what causes them to feel this way, feel depressed, is that during their time of captivity in human trafficking, they are stripped away from social norms and they are unable to live a typical normal life as a normal person would. And because of the work they do in human trafficking, their dignity, or let's say their self-worth, is forcibly taken away by the abuser, because the abuser threatens them, and maybe in this form of mental abuse, they belittle the humanity of these victims. So that's why they feel like their self-worth, their humanity is just gone. So the typical symptoms you can find in someone who has depression is they typically feel very tired. They feel very tired, or this great feeling of fatigue, almost all the time. And point number 2, they typically experience some form of insomnia in which they have less sleep. They just cannot get themselves to sleep at night, or they're oversleeping because of lack of sleep itself. And this lack of sleep possibly triggers from traumatic memories during their time of captivity, which leads them to be unable to have a peaceful rest. And this is something I already mentioned just now, which is feelings of worthlessness, which is in which they are heavily influenced by their abusers, so that they could submit to their abusers. That's why in turn their self-worth just disappears. Third point I would like to address regarding psychological effects in victims in human trafficking is that the victims typically experience ostracism. So what exactly is ostracism? It is when the victim feels the need to distance themselves or withdraw themselves, in simple words, away from social circles, or even family members and close friends they once had, because they've been away from a normal society for a very long time. And the main reason to them distancing themselves from social circles is because due to whatever they experienced in human trafficking, um, they feel guilt and shame from whatever they did during their time in during their time being victims in human trafficking. Um, and also in general, whatever that is happening in human trafficking is a social stigma. Whatever happens in in human trafficking is a big taboo in society. And if you were to ever be involved in it, you'll be shunned in the eyes of society, which is why they feel this guilt and shame, even upon returning home or even talking to their friends or relatives about it. And due to this social stigma, about how terrible human trafficking is, or even being involved in human trafficking, they would have this feeling of being unloved or unwanted by their family due to this social stigma. And normal interactions makes them feel weird or alienated in a way is because due to their being held captive so long by their abusers to commit themselves to human trafficking, they are used to a rather abusive lifestyle. So once an abusive lifestyle is not present in their lifestyle after being rescued from human trafficking, they would feel rather confused. So that's why they would choose to distance themselves from any sort of normal social circles. Further ado, I would like to conclude my part in this presentation, which is psychological effects on human trafficking victims. So these victims, without a doubt, they have to endure brutal psychological obstacles within their time of confinement in human trafficking, or even after being rescued, they are still facing these psychological hurdles. And with that, um, these victims need to seek or need to be sent for immediate psychological care after being rescued to determine their mental being, to improve their mental health, and to ensure that they are able to lead normal lives even after experiencing such inhumane, traumatic experiences within their time in human trafficking. And lastly, should you ever know anyone who was victimized by human trafficking, we need to show all of our love and compassion, and we have to be understanding towards human trafficking victims. This is to ensure that the victim does not feel alienated upon returning to a normal society, and so that we could help stabilize their mental condition and once again improve their mental health. Thank you.